Imagine standing on the edge of promise after years in the wilderness. Today, we're going through Numbers chapters 21 through 36, where battles are fought, blessings are spoken, and God prepares his people to enter the promised land. You can listen to this while you're driving, cooking, working, or simply resting. Just press play and let God's word walk with you as you go about your day. After the first generation of Israelites had passed away, the journey continued under God's guidance. God reminded Moses that the new generation needed to be prepared, disciplined, and educated in his laws. Every act, every command, and every teaching was meant to shape them into a faithful, holy people capable of inheriting the land he had promised. The lessons of obedience, faith, and communal responsibility remained central to their identity as God's chosen nation. The Israelites again faced challenges as they approached the lands bordering Canaan. Fear, doubt, and complaints began to surface among the people, even after witnessing God's miraculous provision and protection. God emphasized that courage, faith, and trust in his promises are essential for success. He reminded them that their victories and blessings depended not on their strength, but on obedience and reliance on his guidance. God instructed Moses on preparing the new generation for the census. Every tribe was to be counted, and leaders were appointed to oversee this task. This census was not merely numerical. It reinforced accountability, organization, and awareness of individual roles within the nation. God showed that structure, preparation, and recognition of every person's value are crucial for communal life and spiritual readiness. The people once again struggled with murmuring and rebellion. God reminded them that disobedience has consequences, but that mercy and restoration are always available. Those who trusted him and followed his commands would experience his provision and guidance. Through these experiences, the Israelites learned that faith requires daily practice, patience, and a willingness to rely on God even in uncertainty. Korah's rebellion, though in the past, served as a lasting lesson. God emphasized that leadership, service, and worship are sacred responsibilities. Those chosen to lead or serve in holy duties must act with humility, devotion, and integrity. Israel learned that God's authority is absolute, and questioning it without his direction carries serious consequences. Holiness and reverence are not optional, but essential in communal and spiritual life. God continued to instruct Moses regarding offerings, purification, and the care of the tabernacle. Every ritual, sacrifice, and command carried meaning, shaping Israel's understanding of sin, mercy, and restoration. The rhythm of daily obedience, reflection, and communal worship reinforced spiritual growth and moral awareness. The people were learning that holiness is lived through both ritual and ethical conduct, impacting their relationship with God and each other. As the Israelites traveled, they encountered neighboring nations. These experiences tested faith, obedience, and courage. God reassured them that victory depends on reliance on him rather than human strength. The leaders, guided by God, made strategic and spiritual decisions, demonstrating that preparation and wisdom are necessary for success. Faithful obedience ensures protection, guidance, and the fulfillment of his promises. Balaam, a prophet from outside Israel, was called to curse the people. God demonstrated his sovereignty by intervening directly, turning Balaam's intentions into blessings for Israel. This event showed that God's plans cannot be thwarted by human schemes or opposition. It reminded the Israelites that his favor, protection, and promises extend beyond what they can see, and that he actively works to ensure the fulfillment of his purposes. The people faced further rebellions, including complaints about food and the hardships of the journey. God responded with both provision and correction. He sent quail to satisfy their craving, but also disciplined those who acted in rebellion or ingratitude. These events taught that God's provision is abundant, but his guidance requires trust, humility, and obedience. Faith involves accepting both blessings and correction as part of spiritual growth. Moses instructed the people on the laws of inheritance, vows, and purification. God emphasized the importance of fairness, responsibility, and ethical living. Property, family, and community responsibilities were to be handled according to his instructions. These laws ensured stability, justice, and holiness within the nation, preparing them for life in the promised land. The Israelites were reminded of the sacredness of life and the holiness of God's dwelling. Priests and Levites maintained the tabernacle, guided worship, and enforced purity regulations. God's presence required respect, attention, and devotion. The people were learning that holiness is not abstract, but lived through careful obedience, ethical behavior, and faithful service. God also emphasized the importance of vows and personal dedication. Those who voluntarily dedicated themselves to Him, such as through the Nazirite vow, were to follow specific practices, demonstrating focus, self-discipline, and separation for holy purposes. These acts reinforced the principles of devotion, reverence, and intentional commitment to God's plan. As Israel approached Moab, they faced further challenges. Fear of surrounding nations, complaints among the people, and moral failings tested their faith. God sent guidance, instruction, and warning to ensure the community remained aligned with His will. The experiences of provision, discipline, and instruction taught the Israelites that faith involves both trust in God's protection and active obedience to His commands. God instructed Moses on the preparation for conquest, including the roles of leaders, priests, and warriors. Every tribe had responsibilities, and every individual had a place in the plan. Order, accountability, and obedience were necessary for success. Israel was learning that God's guidance requires structure and cooperation, and that faith is expressed through action, not just belief. The people were reminded that rebellion, sin, and disbelief carry consequences. God's justice ensures that disobedience does not go unaddressed. At the same time, His mercy provides a path to restoration and reconciliation. These lessons prepared the nation for the Promised Land, teaching that living under God's guidance requires balance between accountability and reliance on His grace. As the Israelites camped in the plains of Moab, God reminded them that obedience and faithfulness were essential for success. The surrounding nations represented both opportunities and threats, and Israel needed to follow God's instructions carefully. Every action, from encampment to battle preparation, carried spiritual significance. God's guidance ensured that the people would not only survive but flourish, demonstrating that His plans require attention, trust, and disciplined obedience. Moses instructed the people regarding their relationship with neighboring nations. They were to maintain ethical conduct, avoid unjust alliances, and trust in God's direction for conquest. God emphasized that integrity, justice, and reliance on His power would secure victory and protection. Israel was learning that spiritual discernment is necessary for navigating both moral and practical challenges. Faith requires courage, wisdom, and submission to God's plan. During this period, the Israelites again faced murmuring and rebellion. Some people complained about leadership, scarcity of food, and the uncertainty of the journey. God responded with both provision and correction. Quail were sent to satisfy physical needs, while discipline reminded the people of the importance of trust and obedience. These lessons highlighted that God's care includes both nurturing and correction, shaping hearts and teaching reliance on His providence. Balaam, the prophet called by Balak, the king of Moab, sought to curse Israel. God intervened directly, turning Balaam's words of intended harm into blessings. This event demonstrated that no human scheme can thwart God's purposes. It also illustrated the principle that God's sovereignty and faithfulness protect His people, even against external opposition. Israel witnessed firsthand that God actively works to fulfill His promises, ensuring His plan remains intact despite human efforts to oppose it. God instructed Moses on the responsibilities of the leaders, priests, and Levites during times of challenge and conflict. Each group had a defined role, ensuring the camp functioned in harmony and that the sacred rituals were properly maintained. God's instructions reinforced that faithfulness involves both spiritual devotion and practical diligence. Leadership, service, and communal responsibility are intertwined, and disobedience in any area can disrupt God's intended order. The Israelites were reminded of the sacredness of life and worship. Priests performed rituals with care, and the Levites carried out their duties meticulously. God emphasized that approaching Him requires reverence, obedience, and attention to detail. The daily practices, from offerings to purification, instilled moral awareness, spiritual discipline, and communal responsibility. Israel learned that holiness is expressed not only in grand acts, but also in routine obedience and devotion. As they journeyed, Israel faced additional challenges from neighboring nations, including conflict and moral temptation. God provided clear instructions on how to conduct themselves, protect the community, and maintain fidelity to his laws. Ethical behavior, justice, and communal responsibility were highlighted as essential elements of faith. God's guidance ensured that Israel's identity as a holy nation remained intact, even in the midst of external pressures and internal challenges. God emphasized the importance of unity and obedience among the tribes. Each tribe had responsibilities, and individuals were accountable for their actions. The people learned that communal harmony, respect for leadership, and adherence to God's commands were crucial for spiritual and practical success. Rebellion or negligence could have severe consequences, yet restoration was always possible through confession, obedience, and reliance on God's mercy. The Israelites were further instructed on offerings, vows, and ethical living. Sin offerings, guilt offerings, and voluntary sacrifices reinforced awareness of God's holiness and the consequences of disobedience. Vows and dedicated service, such as the Nazirite practice, illustrated focused commitment and reverence. These rituals served as constant reminders of the relationship between God and his people, showing that obedience, devotion, and ethical living are inseparable aspects of faith. God reminded Moses to prepare the people for the final stages of their journey. The adults who had doubted him would not enter the promised land, but their children would inherit it. This emphasized the importance of faithfulness across generations and the enduring nature of God's promises. Israel was learning that faith is not only a personal matter but also a legacy, shaping future generations through obedience, teaching, and example. As the journey progressed, God guided Israel in battles against surrounding nations. He emphasized that victory depends not on human strength, but on obedience, faith, and reliance on his power. Leaders were to act wisely, warriors to follow his instructions carefully, and the people to remain unified in purpose. These experiences reinforced lessons of dependence, courage, and submission to God's will. Success comes when faith and action align with divine guidance. God also provided instruction on blessings and curses. Obedience would bring protection, prosperity, and favor, while rebellion would bring correction and consequence. These principles were meant to instill awareness, accountability, and moral responsibility. Israel learned that life with God is dynamic, with choices and consequences reflecting their alignment with his will. Faith involves recognizing the implications of actions and responding with obedience, humility, and trust. Throughout their journey, Israel witnessed God's continuous provision. Manna, water, and protection from enemies demonstrated his care. Yet these blessings also required faith, gratitude, and obedience. God taught that relying on him daily cultivates spiritual maturity and dependence. The people were developing a rhythm of trust, worship, and recognition of his authority, learning that faith is practiced consistently, not sporadically. The leadership of Moses, Aaron, and the priests continued to guide the nation. God emphasized that leadership is a responsibility to serve, protect, and instruct according to his principles. The people were learning that true faithfulness involves respecting authority, participating in communal life, and maintaining holiness. Leaders are accountable to God, and their obedience shapes the spiritual and practical well-being of the entire community. Israel encountered challenges involving morality, justice, and communal integrity. God provided laws addressing theft, honesty, ethical treatment, and communal responsibility. These regulations ensured that life in the camp reflected God's character. The people learned that holiness includes ethical conduct, fairness, and protection of the vulnerable. Obedience to God encompasses both spiritual devotion and everyday moral choices. As the journey drew closer to the borders of Canaan, the people were reminded to be courageous, disciplined, and faithful. God's promises remained certain, but their fulfillment depended on trust, preparation, and obedience. The lessons of the wilderness, discipline, provision, accountability, and reliance on God prepared them to enter the land fully aware of his expectations and ready to live under his guidance. As the Israelites remained on the plains of Moab, rebellion again surfaced among the people. Despite God's repeated provision, many became restless, murmuring against leadership and questioning his guidance. Their fears and complaints reminded them, and the new generation, that faith requires endurance, trust, and obedience even when circumstances seem uncertain. God's lessons through trial were not punishment alone, but preparation for entering the promised land, where obedience and faithfulness would determine their success and blessing. The incident of Balaam illustrated the danger of compromise and moral failure. The people began to follow Moabite idols and engage in sinful practices, drawing God's displeasure. Moses interceded, pleading for God's mercy on behalf of the nation. This event revealed the critical importance of spiritual vigilance, communal accountability, and leadership rooted in prayer and intercession. God's mercy was extended to those who turned back, showing that repentance restores relationship and preserves life. God sent a plague as correction, and the people witnessed his justice and mercy simultaneously. Those who had rebelled faced consequence, while intercession and confession prevented further disaster. The experience reinforced the principle that sin and disobedience have real consequences, but God's forgiveness is always accessible through humility and obedience. Israel learned that faithfulness is demonstrated in both action and moral vigilance, and that communal responsibility matters in maintaining holiness. During this time, the Moabite king Balak sought to curse Israel by hiring Balaam, a prophet from outside their nation. God controlled the situation, showing that his people are protected from schemes designed to harm them. Balaam's donkey miraculously spoke to prevent disobedience, emphasizing that God's sovereignty extends over all creation. Through this event, Israel witnessed firsthand that God intervenes for his people, ensuring that his promises cannot be thwarted by human or supernatural opposition. Balaam's blessings, though intended to curse Israel, became declarations of God's favor. He proclaimed the nation's strength, blessing, and destiny, reinforcing God's plan for his people. The Israelites learned that God's purposes are unchangeable and that faithfulness brings protection and guidance. Even when external threats arise, God's power ensures that his promises are fulfilled. The Israelites faced further moral and spiritual challenges, requiring vigilance and obedience. God emphasized the sacredness of life, the importance of ethical conduct, and the necessity of communal responsibility. Sin and rebellion were addressed swiftly to preserve the integrity of the nation. Through these lessons, Israel learned that holiness extends beyond ritual. It shapes character, relationships, and communal life. As the journey continued, Moses instructed the people regarding inheritance, leadership, and preparation for entering Canaan. Each tribe was assigned responsibilities, boundaries, and roles that reflected God's wisdom and order. The people learned that preparation, organization, and accountability are crucial for success. God's instructions were detailed, ensuring that the nation could enter the land in faith, unity, and obedience, ready to fulfill the purposes he had promised. The final rebellions of the wilderness period reinforced the importance of trust in God. Complaints about hardship, fear of enemies, and frustration with leadership were met with both correction and guidance. God demonstrated that obedience is a continuous requirement and that rebellion delays blessing. Yet his mercy remained accessible, illustrating that faithfulness includes both discipline and restoration. Israel was learning that life with God is a balance of accountability, reliance, and attentive obedience. God emphasized the centrality of the covenant and his presence in every act of worship, leadership, and community life. The Levites and priests continued to maintain the tabernacle, guide offerings, and instruct the people. Every ritual, act of service, and command reinforced the sacredness of God's presence. Israel was learning that faithfulness is expressed through devotion, diligence, and ethical living, both in personal conduct and communal responsibility. As the Israelites prepared to cross the Jordan, God reminded them of his promises and the importance of remembering their history. The generation that had rebelled would not enter the land, but their children, who had learned from the wilderness lessons, would inherit it. This preparation included reminding the people of their victories, God's provision, and the covenant established at Sinai. Faith requires reflection, acknowledgement of God's faithfulness, and commitment to continue living in obedience. Moses gave final instructions regarding leadership, offerings, and communal conduct. The nation was being prepared not only for physical entry into the land, but also for spiritual readiness. God's guidance ensured that the people understood the responsibilities of worship, justice, and communal integrity. The instructions emphasized that obedience, moral vigilance, and service are essential for maintaining favor and blessing in the Promised Land. The blessings over the tribes were pronounced, demonstrating God's continued guidance, favor, and purpose for each family within Israel. Each tribe received affirmation of their role, responsibility, and destiny. These blessings reinforced the lessons of faith, obedience, and communal harmony learned throughout the wilderness journey. God reminded them that their identity, mission, and success depend on remaining faithful to His instructions and covenant. The people were instructed on the boundaries of the land and their responsibilities upon entering it. Ethical conduct, protection of the vulnerable, and observance of God's commands were reinforced as the foundation for a holy, prosperous community. Israel was learning that success in the land requires more than military victory. It requires moral integrity, justice, and wholehearted commitment to God's law. God reminded Moses and the leaders that His presence would go with them into the land, guiding, protecting, and empowering them. Faithfulness, obedience, and unity were emphasized as the keys to thriving under His guidance. Israel witnessed that God's promises are steadfast, that His provision is ongoing, and that His guidance shapes every aspect of life. Trust and obedience ensure that God's plan unfolds according to His purposes. The final chapters of Numbers focus on preparation, blessing, and consolidation of God's covenant. The people were organized, instructed, and reminded of His commands. Leadership, service, and ethical living were reinforced. The journey through the wilderness had shaped Israel into a disciplined, faithful, and holy nation, ready to enter the land promised to their forefathers. God's faithfulness remained evident at every step, and the people were called to live in accordance with His instructions to experience His continued blessing. As the Israelites prepared to cross the Jordan River, God reminded Moses of the importance of obedience, unity, and faith. Every instruction, from arranging the camp to assigning responsibilities to the tribes, was purposeful. The people were to recognize that entering the Promised Land required more than physical strength or numbers. It required trust in God's guidance, adherence to His commands, and a willingness to live according to His laws. The lessons of the wilderness were not forgotten. They were the foundation for life in the land God had promised. Moses instructed the leaders and tribes on the procedures for crossing. The Ark of the Covenant, representing God's presence, was to go before them. God emphasized that His guidance and presence were essential for victory, protection, and successful settlement. Israel was learning that life with God requires following His lead, seeking His direction, and honoring His presence in all aspects of their journey. Faith is active, demonstrated through obedience, reverence, and careful attention to His instructions. Before entering the land, God commanded a final census and organization of the people. This census served multiple purposes. It identified the warriors ready for battle, recognized the contribution of each tribe, and prepared the nation for settlement in their inheritance. Organization, preparation, and accountability are recurring themes in God's instructions. The people learned that success and blessing come when structure aligns with divine guidance, ensuring both spiritual and practical readiness. God reminded the people of the importance of the covenant. Every command, every law, and every ritual was tied to maintaining His favor and ensuring their prosperity. Holiness, obedience, and ethical living were required for the community to thrive. The Israelites were called to remember God's faithfulness, rely on His guidance, and act in ways that reflected His character. Faithfulness is demonstrated in both personal conduct and communal life, creating a culture of integrity and devotion. The final rebellions and complaints had demonstrated the ongoing challenge of faith. Even with God's miracles and guidance, some people continued to doubt, complain, or rebel. God's response balanced justice and mercy, showing that accountability is real, but restoration is always possible. Through offerings, intercession, and obedience, the people could return to favor. Israel learned that faith is a continuous practice, requiring vigilance, trust, and a commitment to God's will, regardless of circumstance. Moses gave instructions regarding leadership succession and the responsibilities of Joshua, who would lead the people into the Promised Land. God emphasized that faithful leadership is essential for the nation's stability, spiritual health, and continued blessing. Joshua was chosen because of his faith, courage, and obedience, reflecting the principle that God raises leaders according to his plan. The Israelites were reminded that leadership is a responsibility to serve, guide, and uphold God's law, not merely a position of privilege. Blessings were pronounced over each tribe, affirming their role, responsibility, and destiny within the nation. These blessings highlighted God's sovereignty, faithfulness, and provision. Each tribe was recognized for its contribution, character, and purpose, reinforcing the importance of obedience, integrity, and alignment with God's plan. Israel was learning that their identity, unity, and success were intimately connected to their faithfulness and adherence to his instructions. God instructed Moses on the boundaries of the land and the distribution of inheritance. Every family and tribe received specific portions, illustrating the principles of fairness, justice, and divine guidance. These allocations ensured that the land would be settled in accordance with God's plan and that the community would function harmoniously. Preparation, structure, and adherence to divine instructions were essential for stability, prosperity, and the preservation of holiness. The people were reminded of the importance of worship, sacrifice, and ritual purity. God emphasized that approaching him requires reverence, attention to detail, and obedience. Priests and Levites maintained the tabernacle, guided worship, and instructed the people in holy living. Every act, from offerings to communal service, reinforced God's presence, mercy, and justice. Israel learned that faithfulness involves both spiritual devotion and practical diligence, demonstrating holiness in every area of life. As the moment to cross the Jordan approached, God reiterated his promises and expectations. Faith, obedience, and unity were required for the conquest of the land. The people were to remember the lessons of the wilderness, reliance on God, trust in his provision, and adherence to his commands. These principles would ensure victory, protection, and blessing as they entered a new phase of life. Israel was prepared, not only physically but spiritually, for the inheritance that awaited them. The final instructions included guidance on justice, ethical behavior, and communal responsibility. God emphasized that life in the Promised Land would require continued faithfulness, moral integrity, and respect for his commands. Israel learned that obedience brings blessing, while rebellion carries consequences. Every choice, from governance to personal conduct, reflects the relationship between God and his people, shaping both individual destiny and communal prosperity. Moses also addressed the importance of remembrance. He urged the people to recall God's faithfulness, provision, and guidance throughout the wilderness journey. Remembering past miracles, victories, and lessons strengthens faith, reinforces obedience, and inspires trust in God's promises. Israel was taught that reflection on God's work builds spiritual maturity and prepares the community for future challenges. The journey of Numbers concludes with preparation, blessing, and consolidation. Israel's experiences in the wilderness had formed a disciplined, faithful, and holy nation. God's presence, guidance, and provision had been constant, teaching lessons of faith, obedience, justice, and communal responsibility. The people were now ready to enter the Promised Land with courage, unity, and devotion, fully equipped to live in accordance with God's law and continue his plan for them. Moses blessed the people one final time, affirming God's faithfulness, provision, and promises. These blessings reinforced the principles learned throughout the journey: trust in God, obedience, faithfulness, and moral integrity. The Israelites were reminded that their success, prosperity, and spiritual health depended on continued adherence to God's commands. Life with God is an ongoing practice of trust, devotion, and obedience, shaping individuals and communities for generations to come. As the people prepared to step into the Promised Land, the lessons of Numbers remained clear. Faith requires trust even when circumstances are uncertain. Obedience ensures God's favor and protection. Leadership, communal responsibility, and ethical living maintain unity and holiness. God's provision, guidance, and justice are constant, shaping a nation capable of fulfilling his promises. Israel's wilderness journey was a masterclass in faith, preparing a generation to inherit the blessings God had long promised. The story of Numbers teaches timeless principles: reliance on God, accountability, communal responsibility, moral integrity, and the necessity of obedience. Every experience, whether miraculous or challenging, was an opportunity to grow, learn, and trust. Israel's journey reminds us that faith is an active, ongoing practice, requiring daily dedication and a willingness to follow God's guidance, no matter the obstacles. As the final moments of preparation concluded, Moses encouraged the people to trust God fully. The promised land awaited them, a tangible manifestation of his promises and faithfulness. Their journey through the wilderness, filled with trials, lessons, and divine intervention, had prepared them spiritually, morally, and communally for the responsibilities ahead. Faith, obedience, and trust in God were the keys to thriving in the inheritance he had prepared. Crossing the Jordan would mark a new chapter, but the principles of Numbers endure. God's faithfulness is unwavering. Obedience brings blessing, rebellion carries consequence, and his guidance ensures success. Israel's story is a timeless reminder that a life aligned with God requires trust, dedication, and a willingness to follow his plan faithfully. The lessons of Numbers are not just for ancient Israel. They are for every generation seeking to live in relationship with God, under his guidance and blessing. With this final preparation, the Israelites stood ready, united, and faithful. God's presence remained with them, guiding each step, ensuring provision, and upholding his promises. The wilderness had shaped them into a holy, disciplined, and faithful nation. They were prepared to inherit the land, live under God's law, and continue the journey of faith, obedience, and devotion for generations to come. That brings us to the end of Numbers chapters 21 through 36. From the wilderness to the edge of promise, we see God's faithfulness, guidance, and preparation. If this message spoke to you, comment, Amen, and subscribe for more Bible clarity and full story teachings. Keep listening, keep learning, and keep walking in faith.